Welcome. Today is the 26th of January, 2021. Can't believe that 2020 is finally over. And, but to be replaced by probably a lot worse. So, but in the meantime, forgetting about all those nasty details for the moment, we're joined again, happily, by Father Chad Ripperger.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be talking about the Theological Notes. And so, Father, let's get in. This is a topic that you don't see discussed much in contemporary theology. So what are the notes of the Church?
Well, the Theological Notes are, it ultimately comes from the Latin word note, or notes, which basically means is the degree by which a thing can be known, or with how much certitude we can actually know a thing. So a theological note is the name given by which the certitude of a particular doctrine is known. Or we may say that the different doctrines have different degrees of certitude based upon the author. So, for example, if something is written by St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Alphonsus Liguori or someone like that, it's going to have a higher degree of certitude than if it's written by, say, a modern theologian who happens to be solid, or one that isn't so solid, obviously. So it basically boils down to the particular author can make, and how many authors sign off on a particular doctrine can increase the certitude that we have about the truth of what's being proposed. Church pronouncements. So that brings up, which is another thing by which we can know the certitude of a particular doctrine. So obviously if something is defined by the Church, then it's de fide, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But other times there's things where the Church will say things, even in a magisterial acts, but they're not infallible, obviously. And so the question becomes, well, how much certitude do we have that's being said in this particular magisterial document? Do we have to actually, how much certitude do we actually have? Do we have to actually believe what is being proposed here in this particular case? And so the degree of the certitude of the doctrine is known as its theological note. That is, its degree of certitude that we have in relationship to it. Just by way of a little bit of introduction, part of the reason we had kind of discussed about doing this particular topic in our exchanges back and forth is the fact that there's a lot of, which many of you have heard me say, there's a lot of lack of precision today in theology and in philosophy, Catholic philosophy. And what does it mean when I say there's lack of precision? There's two parts to it. The first is that the language that people are using does not have the same precision. A lot of that's because the philosophy has collapsed, and the philosophy is very often what gives people the intellectual precision, and also the precision to the particular definitions, meanings of terms, how they're used, etc., throughout the course of the Church's history. And so that gives that precision. A lot of that's dropped today, so you'll hear a lot of things that are said in ways that, well, I wanted to make it understandable to people, etc., but that may be the case, but then the lack of precision can actually end up in causing people to easily fall into error, or even the thing might be expressed in an imprecise way, which actually makes it, can actually make it erroneous, even though it just needs a little bit more precision. The other part of it is that because this precision was something that was built up through the tradition over the course of time, then that means that the precision that we have in our theological language and precisely how terms are used requires a person to have a connectedness to the tradition, both philosophically and theologically. And I find that most modern writers, even if they know a little bit of the stuff from the tradition, their writing tends to be imprecise. So I get criticized quite a bit these days, it seems, by priests and the like who will criticize me for not knowing a particular thing when in point in fact I've based it precisely on how the Church has always talked about this or how the particular saints have said it. And so that precision also gives me the recognition, or gives the person, if they understand precisely how these terms are used, precisely how the doctrine is proposed, etc., then they actually also know what degree does a person actually have to give assent. Because a lot of times, not to go on too long here, but a lot of times what happens is people say, well, the Magisterium said it, therefore it's over. Well, that's not necessarily the case, especially, for example, when you have something like in Vatican II being proposed for religious liberty, which was actually condemned in Libertas Praestantissimum by Leo XIII. So then the question becomes, well, wait a minute, which given the, if we want to be precise theologically, what is the degree of certitude that we have in relationship with the doctrine or the doctrine of a particular thing that's proposed in Vatican II? Because a lot of times people just simply say that, if it's in a council, then it's automatically infallible. Well, that's actually not what the Church actually says, and that's not how the theologians have ever talked. They say it's only when they have the intention of definition. So a lot of the parts of the documents in various councils are actually explanatory leading up to what they define, and that's where they can end up in error. And of course, Paul VI repeatedly said that Vatican II never had any intention of defining anything. There was nothing extraordinary that happened there. It was his precise theological language, which meant that there was no intention of defining anything in Vatican II. And therefore, it means that if a prior doctrine was being talked about in the prior magisterial acts, then a person has to pay attention to that. So it's all really about precision, and I find that today the precision is being eroded by two things. The first is just a lack of scholarship. People just don't go back and take a look at and try and understand exactly how these terms were used throughout the course of history and the tradition. The second thing is that everybody's leading their lives according to emotion, which is all part of the modernist heresy. It's all based upon experience and emotion and things like that. Well, emotions are not precise. The intellect is what has that ability to be acute and precise. And so as a result of that, as people become more emotional within the Church, it's becoming their language, the way they're talking is becoming very imprecise. And so they tend to have we have a situation in the Church now where people who are writing and speaking in the area of philosophy and theology are sometimes making very elementary mistakes, but sometimes just the lack of precision is causing a lot of problems. And I think this has also been the mindset of many in the Magisterium. They don't want things to be precise because they don't want to have to, as we hear, quote, exclude people, unquote, or offend people. And the Church isn't about worrying about where people are at emotionally, except insofar as it's necessary to get them to heaven. Other than that, they really should be worried about making sure that they understand what the Church teaches so that, with clarity, which is what precision brings. It brings clarity, with clarity so that people can actually believe what the Church believes.
So let's, we'll come back to a couple questions about some of that towards the end. But at the moment, let's get into the theological notes then. And I guess we should probably take it from the highest to the lowest. So what's the highest degree of the theological notes?
Okay, so I'm going to base this discussion on the theological notes and on their various degrees taken from Ludwig Ott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. Now, that book itself isn't absolutely perfect because there's a few things in there that most theologians say he kind of gets wrong. But as a general rule, it's a good standard text to go by. So the highest degree of certainty that we have pertains to the immediately revealed truths. That is, those things that we see right in Revelation. So the belief due to them is based upon the authority of God revealing. So we call that Fides Divina, that is, divine faith. So a person who has the faith that God has infused in them, once they see that, they immediately recognize that what God is proposing is true. So the first degree, the highest degree, is if God reveals something, and this is an important point because sometimes you'll hear people say, well, unless the Church defines it, then you can't then it's not infallible. And that's actually not true. If God reveals something, God himself is infallible, so the revelation itself is infallible. If the Church, through its teaching, vouches for the fact that a truth is contained in revelation, one's certainty is then based on the authority of the infallible teaching authority of the Church, and we call that Fides Catholica, or Catholic faith. So if the Church defines something as saying, well, this is part of revelation, then in point in fact, if you deny that, then you don't have Catholic faith. It's just that simple. And that actually brings up a very important point. St. Thomas has a section where in his Summa where he deals with the question of, well, what happens if a person believes everything the Church believes, but there's one area where they deviate from? In modern times, if you use the word heretic, everyone's hair goes up on the end and everyone gets agitated, etc. But the fact is that people can be material heretics, where they They don't really understand what they're denying, but what they're proposing is contrary to what the church teaches. Or they can be formal heretics where they actually give assent to, yeah, I know what the church teaches, but I'm not interested in that. So, or I don't believe in that. So, and so the term heresy, at least when I went through the seminar, it got a bad name. I mean, heresy itself was a bad word. You just didn't use it because of the fact that that was just offensive and you couldn't say that to people, etc. The problem is, again, we're back to this emotion things. Look, if we're going to be worrying about what everyone's feeling, then in the end, we're not going to have this precision, and we're just going to end up getting a lot of other people just aren't going to have the clarity that they need when the truths should be proposed as clear. So if the truths are defined by a solemn judgment of faith, that is the definition of the Pope or of a general council, and those are under the conditions that they state. So you'll get, and this is one of the, it's kind of funny, Ryan is actually the historian, so he would know this better than I. But at the First Vatican Council, one of the big debates was, or one of the reasons I shouldn't say wasn't part of the debates, but one of the concerns that some of the council fathers had in actually not voting in favor of defining papal infallibility wasn't because they didn't believe in the infallibility, but it was because they were concerned that if you defined the Pope, even putting in the conditions under which he was infallible, then what happens is that people will just think everything the Pope says is infallible, and you still have people that behave that way. Although under the current pontificate, I think that's shifted a little bit.
It's interesting how that developed at Vatican I, because the original reason why papal infallibility got on the docket was because of a certain ex-priest, actually, Abbe Lamennais. Yeah, and right. Lamennais had, his ideas were condemned formally by Gregory XVI in Morarivos, and some of them. And he had a number of others. He basically asserted that you couldn't know anything for certain in this world. So this kind of skeptical thought in terms of our epistemology. We couldn't really know things. But the Pope, through his infallibility, can make things known. And therefore what the church really needed to do was have the Pope just declare all these things infallible. And then we would have certitude as to this or that thing. Right, which is a really ludicrous idea when you stop to think about it. So this is one of the, so he was condemned, and that kind of sat. And when the Vatican Council was proposed, it was actually proposed to deal with, the revolutions in Europe, the relationship between the church and the world, and the relationship of the bishops and the church. And so papal infallibility was added to condemn this idea of Lamennais, that everything the Pope says was infallible. But then once it actually gets to debate in the council, mostly as they begin scrutinizing cases where popes are said to have erred in the past, and as they're looking through the doctrine, say, for example, of St. Robert Bellarmine or Albert Pigius and others, and they're parsing out which parts of those theologians they wanted to elevate to the Solemn Magisterium. And then that's when, in the conciliar debates there's the worry. Well, what happens if we define this, and then everyone's going to think everything he does is infallible, and that's where it comes up. And then they go even further. They say, well, maybe we want to deal with the question of what would happen if the Pope became a heretic. And then it was mutually agreed, nobody wants to deal with that. It's essentially how it, much as we deal with that today. And as they punted on a number of those questions. And then in the end, they simply said, well, it seems that the conditions that are placed should be enough. But we can already see, even in the 1910s and the 1920s, that the idea amongst the faithful, it has kind of taken hold, irrespective of the conditions of papal infallibility. People just think everything's infallible.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit of. I often consider that time from after Vatican II or after Vatican I up until Vatican II, kind of the time of the life of St. Peter, where he says to our Lord, even if the others fail, I won't. And then what you have is then, after that, of course, he denies our Lord, which is kind of, I consider somewhat of the post-Vatican II, in the sense that, after Vatican II, you've got this stuff that's just, some of the statements that are being made, even at the level of the pontificate, it causes people to start scratching their heads, etc. So I think it's, and this is one of the reasons why the part of the precision that we're talking about is making sure that you understand precisely when the Pope is infallible, and then when he's not, what kind of degree of assent do you have to give to it, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But what do you have to, what kind of degree of assent you have to give to it?
So let's actually review quickly, speaking of precision. Fides Divina, this is something God has revealed. So, for example, like in Scripture, for example.
Right.
Fides Catholica, this is what the infallible teaching of the authority of the Church has revealed.
Right. So it's what the Church basically has said, this part of Revelation, or this is contained in Revelation, or what is in Revelation, this is what the meaning actually is.
Okay.
That's how it's to be understood.
Right. And then we have De Fide, which there's two distinctions on De Fide, and we'll get to the other one in a second, but for the moment, De Fide Definita, which is a solemn judgment of the Magisterium.
Right. So that's the one in which it's defined of the faith. So it's something in which the Church itself has said, this is how it's to be believed. Anything outside of that is contrary to what is to believe. And you must give assent to these in order to be Catholic and to have Catholic faith. Which actually, I didn't finish off my observation about St. Thomas Aquinas. So he actually says, in relationship to faith, he said, if there's one doctrine of which the Church requires me to believe, and I do not believe it, he said, and I know what that doctrine is, and I formally make an intellectual act contrary to that, where I disbelieve it, then in that particular case, he says it corrupts the virtue of faith, and you're no longer Catholic. Essentially, so it takes only one doctrine for a person to lose their Catholicity. Let me state that again. You become a heretic. You actually cease being Catholic by rejecting a single doctrine which the Church says you must believe. Right. So when people sit there and say, oh, well, I don't believe that. I believe everything the Church says, except I just can't accept their teaching on contraception. Sorry, the Church has said, no, you got to believe this because it's been proposed throughout time, etc. So the point being is that, and then St. Thomas says, well, what does this really mean about people who don't believe what the Catholic Church believes? I mean, they think that Christ is the Messiah. They think he's the Son of God. They think he's this, that, and the other thing. And St. Thomas says, once the virtue of faith gets corrupted in the intellect of the individual, and they're no longer Catholic in the proper sense, he said all their other beliefs are purely at the level of opinion. Now, that's a fascinating statement. It's opinion. Now, this is Christ himself even said, towards the end times, I don't think we're exactly in the end times, although some of the stuff that's coming up is looking pretty apocalyptic in certain respects, but we're not obviously the man of perdition. Certain conditions haven't been met for him to actually be here yet. But here's at least from what I can see. But, he actually says, be a lot of distinctions of opinion. There's going to be people there's just going to be divisions. People are not going to give assent or believe the same things. This is due in large part because over the course of the history of the Church, there was a body of theological, I'm not sure how I'd quite put it. The way that it was, there was a body of theological opinion, and we'll talk about what that means. It's not opinion, it means sententia. We'll talk about what that word means in just a little bit. But there was proposals that were given over the course of time. There was this body of doctrine that was developed over the course of time around the things that weren't necessarily defined by the Church. And that body of doctrine that came through there, which was based upon what the Church taught, etc., became the standard by which everyone conformed themselves to, in order to be able to basically plug into the whole theological discussion. You weren't even considered a decent theologian unless you knew that basic body of doctrine by the various theologians, etc., throughout time, the saints, etc. You had to have a certain grounding and a certain knowledge of that before you would even be able to be taken seriously in relationship to the discussion. That's all collapsed now. And so, much like a Protestant ethos, everybody thinks that the Holy Spirit inspires them directly, so they just start piping up everything. You see this especially on the internet. People start piping up, making statements about theological things of which they don't have any certitude whatsoever.
Let's go back just a little bit to the important distinction. So anybody who rejects one doctrine that the Church, teaches is revealed de fide.
Right.
Where the church says that basically you are bound to hold this doctrine, and you say, I'm not so sure about that. I think it's this way for whatever reason.
Right.
And so now you hear this thing today. Well, once Catholic, always Catholic, because you're baptized and you have the mark of the character of baptism. So therefore, you're always Catholic and you can never not be Catholic. But this idea is very pernicious, in my opinion, today. It's very widespread.
Yes.
But what the traditional teaching in ecclesiology, which St. Robert Bellarmine lays down, that he's drawn from the Church Fathers, is that, and actually, and I think a good argument has been made that the Vatican II upholds this very same teaching from Bellarmine, that one is a member of the Church who has a tripartite indicators of membership. That is, he professes right faith, he has the same communion of the sacraments, beginning with baptism, right, and he has the same communion with the hierarchy.
Yeah, that's right, under the same government.
Yeah, and so those three things. And so if you're missing any of those three things, you're not properly Catholic.
Right.
But today, it seems everyone shifted the onus onto the character of baptism, which interestingly is the same error that Father Feeney gets into. Right. Even though everybody who holds this opinion rejects Father Feeney. But
right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think that there a twofold distinction actually has to be made. It's true that the indelible mark is there. It's indelible, which means it can't be wiped off. But the indelible mark is not the same thing as the faith. St. Thomas says the indelible mark is actually in the intellect by which a person is able to command sacrifice to be done, at least in relationship to baptism, which is, ironically, the whole baptism, or the priesthood of the laity is not the same as the sacerdotal priesthood, because the sacerdotal priesthood is an additional indelible mark, which gives him the ability to command the sacraments to occur. That's distinct from the indelible mark of the laity, which is actually to be able to be priests in the sense of offering their sacrifices to God in a rightly ordered way. That's what that indelible mark is ultimately ordered towards. Okay. That part in the intellect is distinct from the infused virtue of faith, which is in the intellect. And you can corrupt that that virtue in the intellect. And as a result, you can still have the indelible mark while still being faithless, that is, not having Catholic faith, etc. That has to be distinguished from what you just mentioned, which is, I agree, is very pernicious. They say once a Catholic, there's a Catholic. Okay, let's all face it. When you grow up through a Catholic catechetical program, the person begins to have, there are certain intellectual habits of thinking that the person develops through that process. Everybody who goes through any formation, intellectual formation, whether it's public school, Lord forbid, but if it's public education or some other thing, there's always some type of intellectual formation that occurs in relationship to that. So when you become a Catholic, there's all sorts of intellectual habits that are developed about what's right and wrong and what's this, or, what is to be believed, etc., not to believe. But those intellectual habits are distinct from the infused virtue of faith. So they can lose the infused virtue of faith and still have those habits. This is why people will leave the Catholic Church, but there's always this, they still behave or think, at least in relationship to their formation of conscience in that way.
Right. Okay, so let's get to...
There's one other we need to kind of discuss, which is the Fides Ecclesiastica.
Oh, yeah.
So just to back up, Fides Divina, as you mentioned, Ryan, let's do a little bit of review, is that's which is revealed by God. The Fides Catholica is when the church says this is what Revelation, it's in Revelation, and this is what it means. And that definition, that means it's de fide definita, which is distinct from another kind, which we'll see here in a minute. Then there's another kind, and this is a very important point. This is where some of the theologians, especially in the like Congar and some of these guys got into trouble a little bit later. So it's there is a type of there are teachings which the church proposes, and the church has made an authoritative, definitive teaching on it, and it must be accepted with faith, but it's based solely on the authority of the church. This is called Fides Ecclesiastica. A perfect example of that is the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So, and this is one of those areas where it's based purely on what the church says. There is stuff in the tradition, but it's not in the formal revelation. and as a result of that, it's something which has been passed on through the church throughout its history. All the Orthodox theologians and saints, obviously who are Orthodox, signed off on it, etc., and it got to the point where the church had to define it because it could easily be denied. This is based solely on the side of the church. Some of them started getting into trouble afterwards because if it wasn't in Scripture, they weren't going to buy it. And so a lot of them kind of started poo-pooing a couple of things. The first is the perpetual virginity of Our Lady. They'll admit that she was a virgin at the time of the conception of Christ, but they deny it sometimes even afterwards. Or it's the same thing with the Assumption. They kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever, what the church wants to say, but they ignore it and acting as if it's not something that's defined and that you must believe it in order to be Catholic.
Right. In spite of a solemn judgment from Pope Pius XII. But,
yes, exactly. Right. One other thing I should mention is that these doctrines, the Fides Divina, Fides Catholica, anything that's defined by the church, the Fides Ecclesiastica, all bind under the pain of mortal sin. So if you reject them, then not only do you commit an act of heresy, but it's actually mortally sinful.
Now, someone will say, what about just some ignorant person, some shepherd, whatever, and he's, goes to church and he prays and he is completely ignorant of all these doctrines.
That's right.
Is he going to be damned because he doesn't know these things, so he doesn't profess? And if somebody were to mention it and you're kind of clueless.
Yeah, and that's where the church makes, there's a threefold distinction. The first is, there's one thing that's called ignorance. If you just don't know, well, it's not, you're not, in that lack of knowledge, you're not acting formally contrary to the infused virtue and faith that's in you. And so that's just ignorance. It's based in ignorance if you just don't know. Then you can have somebody who's a material heretic, and that is they're proposing something, they're thinking something that's contrary to the church, but it hasn't corrupted their virtue of faith, and I'm going to explain why that is here in just a second. But they haven't corrupted their virtue of faith because they haven't formally recognized what the church actually taught. If they actually knew what the church taught, they would more than likely change their position. And then there's that which is distinct from a formal heretic who knows what the church teaches, and yet he still rejects it. Okay, so why is this formality important? St. Thomas says that the virtues are voluntary. What does that mean? It means that if you go through the motions in doing something, we call it as an exorcist, we call it external compliance. People will do things externally, but they're not doing what they need to do internally in order to develop the proper discipline and virtue in relationship to that thing. So you see this among teenagers, right? They'll clean their room because they actually don't want to get grounded, or the young kid does what he's doing because he doesn't want to get spanked. But they're not developing the virtue in the process because of the fact that they're not thinking to themselves, okay, I want to do this thing so that I become more disciplined. It's when you volitionally enter into doing those things, you develop the habits and virtues that are proper to that. Okay, so in relationship to the virtue of faith, if you don't voluntarily, that is, if you don't willingly, and in order for a thing to be willing, you have to know what it is, and you have to give consent to it, or give intellectual consent and will it. If you don't will it, then you're not creating the opposite vice in relationship to faith, and therefore corrupting the virtue of faith. So it's the voluntariness of it. This is why, a lot of people will say things like, well, this pope was a heretic or that pope was a heretic. Well, the problem is that we can say that, at least on the material level, if they're proposing things on the face of it that appear to be false, but we don't know on the side of the formal part of it without somehow their will being revealed. And this is why the church, before they declare someone a heretic, they actually have to put the person through a formal process, because they have to make sure that the person first hears what the church teaches and then manifests their will contrary to that. Then they can say, okay, this person's a formal heretic. Okay. So, but it's the same thing here in relationship to that the person who's just ignorant, the problem there is a lack of catechesis, which is a big problem today.
You can say that again. Nevertheless, so we have those formal doctrines the church require. There's notes of a doctrine that the church requires the faithful to believe, obliges their belief there. Then there's certain things that she also teaches but not directly through the magisterial office. And so in this category is called by some theologians de fide non definita.
Right.
So how can something be of the faith but not be defined?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. And the way you phrased that was very precise, by the way. And basically what that means is that even though it's not defined by the Magisterium, it is, the Magisterium does consider it, in a certain sense, as to be of the faith, in the sense that they indirectly would correct the error if it was consistently going contrary to what the church knew to be true. What does that mean concretely? So Pius IX in Tuus Libenter states that not only are the decrees and councils of the Pope of the ordinary magisterium throughout the world to be considered infallible, but also the universal, so it has to be universal, and the constant consensus of theologians as it pertains to the faith. Now, let me just back up a little bit. Tuus Libenter, so basically the church has said for some time, and theologians have always known that if all of the fathers of the church there was a virtual unanimity among all the fathers of the church that a particular doctrine, even if what the church hadn't defined it, was of the faith. That means you had to believe this in order to be Catholic. Then the church, especially we see this with Pius IX and Tuus Libenter, which, by the way, this was just a codification of what many theologians had been talking about already beforehand, that if they infallibly said it, and by the way, Pius IX isn't the only one who said it. There's other popes that also had talked about this. It had appeared in other magisterial documents. But they said if the patristics all hold, if there's a virtual unanimity, that they believe that this is of the faith, then you are bound as a Catholic under pain of mortal sin to believe that. Okay. And this becomes a particularly important point, because then this avoids one of the problems where people says, well, if the church hasn't defined it, then I don't have to believe it. Well, okay, I don't care that the father said it. No, actually, no, that's not how the church even understands it. If the fathers of the church all propose it as infallible, this is one of the reasons why I actually wrote the book, which I just recently put out, which is on the patristics and theologians of the church. And so you can go there. And also many of the things that I'm talking about in here are actually in my book on the binding force of tradition, where I kind of lay all this stuff out and get into a few other things here and there. The other thing is in Tuus Libenter, so it's also the universal and constant consensus of theologians. Now, recently I was criticized by a layman who did not know that the church and Pius IX had said that it was the theologians that you had to give assent to. So he went back and he read it, he misread it, and then he put out something else, which just exacerbated the problem. It was a failure to understand that when I say theologians, I'm not talking about the theologians today, because quite frankly, I don't know if I want, some of the past theologians like Ronner and Skillebex and these kinds of people being the ones determining doctrine. Obviously, I don't. Or even today, obviously, we don't want certain guys running around who are trying to promote the licéity of homosexual unions, proposing these things. I don't want them to be the ones determining doctrine, obviously. By theologians, there's a very specific meaning of what that is. It refers specifically to the theologians and the theological schools between 1100 and 1750. That's the line of demarcation. So if that group of men and theological schools, which would include like the Franciscan, the Salamancan, etc., if those theologians from 1100 to 1750 all held that something was of the faith, then you are bound to believe it. It is de fide. It is of the faith, even though it's non definita. It's not defined. So you are bound to believe it under pain of mortal sin. This is something that is quite important, because there's a lot of people that just simply dismiss, especially this, to say, oh, well, I'm not interested in the manuals, I'm not interested in the stuff that went before it, especially after Trent, because Trent had a lot of clarity, a lot of the theologians got real, especially after Vatican II, the modernist ones got real negative about Trent and that time frame from Trent on. And so they just didn't want anything that had to do with it. But this isn't dealing with just that time frame, even though it does include it. It's actually dealing with, everybody from 1100. So that includes St. Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Suarez, all these guys that were in that. If they all said, hey, this is of the faith, then it's of the faith.
Right. So how about the when the popes come out, for example, in St. Alphonsus Liguori's work on the moral theology, the very introduction to the work is about 30 or 40 pages of propositions condemned by various popes.
Right.
So essentially theological censures. For example, if the proposition that you can kiss passionately when you're not married, and as long as it doesn't lead to anything else, it's not a sin. People think that today. That's actually formally condemned by Pope Alexander VII.
That's right. Yeah.
So when you have a censure of that sort, what's the nature of that theological censure? What's its theological note?
Obviously, if you're talking about something that is in relationship to what has been defined by the Church, let me give you just an example, just a couple of these, because I think that might be helpful for people. So a case of Fides Divina, which is in Revelation, that you hear people denying today, which is heretical, right? So anytime you propose something or believe something contrary to divine faith, Catholic faith, or ecclesiastical faith, it's just heretical. So an example of what's a part of the divine faith is when it is said in Scripture numerous times that salvation is Christ is the only one through whom salvation comes, right? He's the only Savior, and so you hear people say, oh, well, you can get to heaven in other ways. No, you can't. You can only get to heaven through Christ. That's one of the examples of that. Okay. And I gave one for ecclesiastical faith. One that is of Catholic faith would be the infallibility of the Pope, in fact, because it's in Scripture where Christ said to Peter, whatever you bind on heaven shall be bound on earth. And the Church then says that means he's infallible under these conditions. Okay. If it's non-definita, then it's the opposite of that. So when someone says something that's that's contrary to what the Church says is of the faith, even though it hasn't been defined, is what we call that propositio heretica. That is a heretical proposition. And this basically is a theological censure. It's a judgment which characterizes a proposition touching upon Catholic faith or moral teaching, but it is contrary to the faith, or at least as doubtful. So theological censures are of two kinds: an authoritative or judicial judgment, and what we sometimes call a private doctrinal judgment. An authoritative or judicial judgment is one in which the teaching authority, that is the magisterium within the Church, has made a pronouncement. Okay, so if the Church has said it, then that's it. A private doctrinal judgment is that which is pronounced by the theological science, and by that is meant the various saints and theologians throughout history, which have made statements about the truth or falsity of a particular type of proposition. So a proposition in opposition to a de fide proposition is called a heretical proposition. So to believe a heretical proposition, even if it's non-defined, or in other words, if you think or give assent to a heretical proposition, it's morally sinful, and you can't get into heaven as a result of it. Okay. Now, the theological censures, which you talked about, there are different kinds. I mean, there's solemn condemnations of certain things, like you see in the Council of Trent. They'll have certain canons. So the canons will say anathema sit at the end of it. So if you believe this, 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 and this, then anathema sit, which means a formal condemnation. And those are infallible. Then there are those which the popes can also do solemn condemnations. They'll also have ones that aren't solemn condemnations, but you're still bound by them when the popes say this is contrary to the Catholic teaching, which is, if I'm not mistaken, I'm open to correction here, but that's where the Syllabus of Errors of Pius IX falls into those non-solemn condemnations, most of them, I believe. So some of them might be solemn. I'd have to take a look at that, but they're non-solemn, but you're still bound by them as far as the condemnations of the Church.
Right. Or again, Pius XII's condemnation of polygenism.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and that's one of the things that you're seeing too is, the Church hasn't defined it, and that's an interesting area. When you talk about precision, when you talk about like his discussion about when you can use the modern scripture exegetical methods, under what conditions, there was a lack of precision. They just applied it to everything without even taking any consideration of the fact that these can be used, but under very strict circumstances and requiring the virtue of faith, etc. Or another area was in his discussion of evolution. They all just went off and said, oh, well, then you can just, you can believe it in this, that, and everything. And that's not exactly what the guy is saying. So anytime we try and bring precision into the discussion, the people who don't have precision but become emotionally attached to their position start to rebel.
Right. So then there's another category that Ott talks about, and that we see it in certain places. Sententia fidei proxima, a proposition that is proximate to the Catholic faith. So let's discuss this one.
Okay, so this is a doctrine which is regarded by theologians generally as a truth of revelation. So it's part of revelation in some way, but which has not been finally promulgated as such by the Church. In other words, hasn't been defined, and the theologians haven't said that you absolutely, that this is part of the Catholic faith. So it's outside that scope, but it's connected to, that's why it's called the Sententia Fidei Proxima. It's connected to something that is of the faith. Now, let me back up. The Latin word sententia. Now, Ryan is obviously the Latin scholar here, although I have been reading it for a while. But here's the thing. The term sententia, people would, if you transliterate it as sentence, that's not what's being conveyed. Sententia is a proposition for belief, right? Sometimes it's translated as opinion, sometimes it's translated as, but it's not opinion. Opinio is what they actually use in Latin, which we'll see a little bit later. That is actually different from a sententia. Sententia is a proposition that requires belief in some sense. So it's a proposition which we should believe in some way, but there's a degrees of theological certitude about that, which we'll see, because there's different sententia. There's not just sententia fidei proxima, there's other ones as well. So this is regarded by theologians as a truth of revelation, which hasn't been defined yet, or which that the theologians wouldn't say are part of the de fide non definita. So this one normally binds under pain of mortal sin, normally speaking. So most theologians say if you reject something that's sententia fidei proxima, then it's morally sinful. And usually because if you deny it, you're going to end up in heresy about the thing that is de fide. Sententia fidei proxima comes from revelation, even though they're not defined, and a denial of them is grave matter based upon the principle of obedience to God, part of which is our moral obligation to submit our intellects to truth which he reveals, as well as the denial of them corrupts faith, corrupts the virtue of faith, since faith is essentially ordered to give assent to what is revealed. So an example of a sententia fidei proxima is a proposition. So these are examples that I took from Ott, because I didn't want to get into debates about people. That's just your opinion. Well, no, actually it's Ott. And Ott is pretty much the standard. Once in a while you get theologians who, throughout the course of time would start arguing a little bit over what degree of certitude a particular thing have. But in this particular case, that the Trinity can only be known by divine revelation is sententia fidei proxima. Now, basically what that means is that you cannot know with certitude that God is triune through the natural light of reason or just by looking at creation. It has to come through revelation. It's opposite. So the contrary to that, a proposition contrary to a sententia fidei proxima are called propositions proximate to heresy. So it's propositio heresiae proxima. So this is if you propose this, then it by way of conclusion, it's going to lead to error, that is, a heresy in the end. So Hegel, for example, tried or attempted to prove that the Trinity based on consciousness. If you look at consciousness, you could unpack it a little bit, and that would give you an idea of the Trinity. And the Church has said no to that. The only way you can really know or the theologians have said the only really way that you can know the Trinity is through divine revelation.
So the next thing be something pertaining to the faith, or theologically certain. So let's talk about this particular nota. Okay.
So this is a proposition which the Magisterium has not defined, but whose truth is guaranteed by its intrinsic connection with the doctrine of revelation. That is, it's a theological conclusion. So to deny something, a theologice Certa proposition, or a theologically certain proposition, is to deny the doctrine of revelation by way of conclusion. So it's very similar to Sententia Fide Proxima. So one of them, so I'll give you a couple of examples. So something that's theologically certain is that everyone has their own guardian angel, or that the Son proceeds from the intellect of the Father. Now, we all know the Church has defined that the Son proceeds from the Father. But the question is how does he proceed? And so, basing it upon the theology of St. Augustine, which was adopted pretty much wholesale throughout the entire history of the Church, is that the Father, when he reflects upon himself and conceives himself, that self-conception is absolutely perfect and is a perfect mirror image of him, and that's the second person of the Trinity, the Son. So they say it proceeds from the intellect of the Father. So that would be an example of of something that is theologically certain. We also know this too because it's also, you can also do it by way of conclusion by virtue of the fact that in John, in the very first opening of John, the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and that's why they unpack what the term Word means. Word is a conceptual thing, and so that's why they said that the Son proceeds from the intellect of the Father.
And then in the past we've talked about opposites. What's the opposite to something that's sententia theologicae certa?
So this is a proposition we would say it's a proposition savoring of or suspect of heresy. So
that word again.
Yes, exactly. It's so funny because when I was going through the seminary back in the 80s, before I joined the Fraternity of St. Peter, that's one of the reasons I went to the Fraternity of St. Peter. I wanted to go to a place where orthodoxy was not a non-issue, and anytime you just even hear the word heresy, the professors would just get all agitated, and obviously they've been conditioned to that by their formation, etc., by people who were not on the up and up, but it's not a bad word. It's a good word because it helps us. It actually comes, Ryan can correct me, it comes from the Greek word which means choice, right?
Right.
So it's actually, you're choosing not to believe what the Church has. So it's back to this will thing again as far as the formal heresy thing. Okay, the reason it is suspect or savoring of heresy is because if one draws the natural conclusion from the proposition, one will end up denying a proposition which the Magisterium has pronounced on. Normally, these kinds of propositions constitute grave matter because of the connection to the magisterial teaching. So this would be something that's suspect of heresy. And I can't think of an example of that right off the bat, other than...
Well, here's one, although we might be wading into territories can fill up our inboxes. But... Well, so something that's theologicae certa is essentially what other theologians such as B.O. and Van Noort and others they call secondary objects of infallibility.
That's right.
And
yeah.
So
that would be good.
Right. So an example of that would be the infallibility of canonizations, which
right.
Since the canonization of John Paul II, Paul VI, and Oscar Romero and others, people have stopped and said, well, how can they be infallible? And, and then tried out various arguments. Well, it's not contained in Revelation, which completely misses the point because it's, and I gave a talk on this with Brother Andres on his Crusade channel, and if anyone's familiar, where I lay out a lot of those arguments. So, but the theologians almost unanimously, really, they demonstrate a consensus after about the 16th century. They really do hit a consensus on the infallibility of canonizations based on the final decree of the Pope.
Right.
So, so basically, wouldn't it be savoring of heresy to deny that?
Yes, I think so, or suspect of heresy. I think the real issue is, which we've talked about, and I'm sure you did talk about if I have to remember watching that, is that, really what it boils down to is it's a lack of understanding of what that decree of canonization actually is. It's merely a declaration that the person made it to heaven, and by way of conclusion, you can therefore have public cultus in relationship to the individual. It does not guarantee the person's exemplary of life. It does not guarantee any of that. And sometimes people, I'm sure this will fill up the inbox and people will be all tore up about this, but, people say, well, do you think that these people are saints? I said, well, they're in heaven, just as a lot of people got to heaven, and we have the Feast of All Saints. There's all sorts of people that are in heaven that didn't lead very exemplary lives and managed to be saved on their deathbed. And I think that some of these popes, we know that John Paul II and Paul VI received the last rites on their deathbed, etc. So, providing there was no obex, and that's basically what this infallible judgment is saying, is, well, technically we know the person's in heaven and there's no obex in relationship to the person being willing to receive the sacraments of the church, and so they died in the sacraments of the church, and that means you have reasonable hope that they were saved, etc. So the point being is I think there are reasons that can be argued that does not, I don't want to get into all of the legitimate discussion about some of the things that they did that were very questionable. That's not the issue. The issue is, what was the status of them at the time of their death? That's the real question. And that the church is making an infallible judgment in relationship that this person made it into heaven, and that's it. So that all being said, yes, that would be something. So when people say that the secondary objects of infallibility are, they reject that definitely, especially, like you said, because the theologians had worked that out very clearly and precisely, for lack of a better word, before the council, that would be suspect of heresy.
Right. Or how about the common teaching, Sententia Communis?
Okay, so the Sententia Communis is a doctrine which in itself belongs to the field of free opinions. Now that has to be clarified a little bit here. But which is accepted by theologians generally. Okay, so what does that mean? Theological opinions are free views on aspects of doctrines concerning faith and morals, which are neither clearly attested in revelation, nor decided by the authority teaching of the church. Okay, so it doesn't fall into these categories that we've talked about above. Their value depends upon the reasons adduced in their favor. So the common opinion of theologians is usually how that's translated. But the Sententia Communis is a proposition by the common theologians, by universal or general. Generally, this is what they actually believe in relationship to it. So their value depends upon the reasons adduced in their favor. And this brings up a very important point. How theologically certain we are of those things that are Sententia Communis is based upon the argument, that is, how compelling is it to reason, based upon the principles of the faith, etc. Who's proposing it, so the various theologians, etc., that are proposing it. The attitude of the church that it's taken towards it, have they kind of signed off on it, or said yes or no, or haven't said anything about it? So it's a point of doctrine ceases to be an object of free judgment when the teaching authority of the church takes an attitude which is clearly in favor of one of the opinions. So once the church then says, if there's different opinions in relationship to it, then that means there's a shift in the theological certitude that we have it, and it ceases being part of this theological note that is the common opinion. So there are different levels of theological opinion in relationship to different propositions, and this is where the precision comes in, because one of the biggest mistakes that people make is they think that you can deviate from these common teachings of the theology. Oh, well, that's just what St. Thomas and St. Alphonsus said. I don't have to believe that because the church hasn't defined on it. You can't do that without substantive reasons or a proportionate reason. Why? Because of what I just said. First of all, our faith must not be based upon our own judgment. It has to be based upon an external criteria. And the church has basically said that the external criteria is what we've talked about, what preceded in this whole interview. But the other part of it is that if certain saints that the church has declared as doctors of the church, or held there, like St. Alphonsus Liguori's moral theology, the church has held that up. He's the moral doctor of the church, right? And so if the church holds up the particular man as saying his body of work is to be studied and emulated and that type of thing, then the church is expecting you to basically conform to that unless you have sufficient reasons. What's a sufficient reason? Well, that reason itself finds a problem with it, not your emotions, not because it's what everybody has an opinion about today, etc. It has to be a logical reason as to why that doesn't follow. Or It has to be because there is some other substantive reason which would give indication of like, well, wait a minute, we just discovered this over here, and therefore, etc. However, as a general rule, God isn't going to let the common opinion of theologians just be completely wide of the mark. There's usually going to be some truth in relationship to it. So, but what would be examples of the Sententia Communis? That God knows future contingents with infallible certainty. In other words, he knows all the future choices that everybody's ever going to make for the rest of history and throughout time. He already knows those now. Why? Because he's outside of time. So what he sees in the beginning of the creation and what he sees at the end of creation is all the same to him. He sees it all at once. And he knows them with infallible certainty. Doesn't mean he causes them. Except it doesn't mean he determines them, I should say. He does give your will the ability to make those choices, but he leaves it to you to make that determination, but he knows what that determination is. Or another one is, no creature can be the principal cause on its own power to create something out of nothing. This is basically a formal way of saying that no creature can, properly speaking, create something out of nothing. So that's a Sententia Communis doctrine. The opposite of that would be a propositio erronea, or erroneous proposition. This is a proposition which is opposed to truth, which is proposed by the Church as a truth intrinsically connected with revealed truth, which is an error in ecclesiastical faith, or opposed to the common teaching of theologians, which is a theological error. In order to deviate from the common teaching of the theologians, as I said, there must be substantive reasons. And by the way, it's not just because you like it. This is one of the things that just drives me bananas when I get on the internet and people they've become emotionally invested in a particular type of way of thinking in relationship to certain things because of the fact that they like it, or that, their mother is doing it, their father's doing it, or there's all these reasons. This all has to be based purely on reason. So if one deviates from it without substantive proportionate reason, it's what's called a temerarious proposition. So you can, if it's erroneous, then it's a theological erroneous. If one deviates from the common opinion of theologians without a substantive reason, it's a temerarious proposition. That is, deviating without sufficient reason from the general teaching. This is important because most theologians generally consider it. They'll ask the question, well, what's the gravity if you deviate from it? Well, it generally has to do with the nature of the teaching. So if the teaching is something that's dealing with a grave matter area or something that's very serious, then to deviate from the common opinion of theologians is considered grave matter. If it's something that's minor, then it's just considered venial in that regard.
Now, in the midst of some of these categories, you have certain discussions in the history of the Church. Say, for example, De Auxiliis, that is on efficacious grace, and the fight in the 16th century between the Dominicans and the Jesuits. The latter, the Dominicans holding the position of Banez, and on Promotio Physica, whereas on the other hand you have the Jesuits holding what later becomes known as Molinism. And the Church, in the end, condemned neither side.
That's right.
But simply came down and said, you guys can debate it in your own houses. Nobody may call the other one a heretic, and we're going to have peace. And that decision of Pope Paul V remains with us today. So what would be would there be any kind of note for that particular issue?
Yeah, there is. It's this is the theological position, or the Sententia Probabilis, Probabilior or Benefundata. So these are the opinions, a probable opinion. Then there's ones that it's more probable that this is the case, or that it's well founded. So I have my own position, particular opinions of the matter. I'll just let it out, and people I'm sure will blow up Ryan's inbox over this one and mine too. But I think that Molina didn't have it right. So I tend to follow the Thomistic position or the Dominican position, and also I think the one that lays it out pretty well is Gerlach-Lagrange, and of course was Dominican. But I think that they tended to kind of go that. But so I think that they have the more probable opinion in relationship to that. There is a certain amount of freedom or latitude, but a person has to be very careful. It's not just a matter of choice. I like this. This sounds good to me. No, a person shouldn't settle on either one of those things without doing an enormous amount of study and research of both sides and see where the problem, what the weight of the various arguments are that are involved in it. So, for example, when it came to that particular question, I was asked to teach a class on grace, and I hadn't, even though I had been kind of studying the question on and off for a few years, I just hadn't had clarity in my own mind about it. And I just said, no, I don't want to get involved in that until I got a certitude about that. And then after that, over the course of about 2 or 3 years after that, doing a lot of the research, it became very clear, especially reading the stuff on St. Thomas, in relationship to predestination and how he lays out how actual grace works in that process, really gave me a lot of clarity, at least for me. So, but there's a certain freedom that one has, in relationship to those things. However, you shouldn't just be choosing them willy-nilly. It should really be based on sound reason. An example of those is one which you just talked about is, the whole thing of actual grace, etc. A couple of other ones are that St. Joseph was confirmed in grace at the time in which he agreed to take the Blessed Virgin Mary on as spouse. That is usually considered a sententia benefundata. It's well-founded that he was actually confirmed in grace from that point on. So, which is different from being, so he was conceived in the state of original sin. He was sanctified in the womb. That's the general opinion, or I should say that's, kind of I don't know if it would be a general opinion, but it's probably a more, a sententia communior, that is a more common opinion, is that he was sanctified in the womb, and then God preserved him in grace, and then once he accepted Our Lady as his spouse, then God confirmed him in grace, which basically means he could never commit mortal sin for the rest of his life. So, and that's kind of one of those that's, I think, is benefundata.
Right. Now, what about, because we mentioned the De Auxiliis, and I'll bring that back again, because you also have another view in that of St. Robert Bellarmine and St. Alphonsus Liguori, which is congruism, which rejects Molinism, but also rejects the notion of premotio physica, and instead replaces it with that they come de congruis, that it comes in the time which is the most suitable for the person to receive that grace infallibly.
Right.
And so the followers of these various views on De Auxiliis, well, each one might say that it's probabilior. And, I'm sure the Molinists think that they're probabilior, and the Thomists are thinking, well, no, we're probabilior.
Right, yeah. Well, that actually brings up a good point, is that obviously some of these theological notes themselves are known with certitude. So we know that when something's de definita, or when someone's the common opinion of the theologians, we generally know what those are. When you get into some of these other areas, you'll actually see that even in some of the discussion, especially from the 1700s on, about what the degree of theological certitude. You'll see minor variances in relationship to that. You'll see minor variances among the theologians about different points of Catholic propositions, and so you'll see those differences here and there.
All right, so next we come to pious opinions, sententia pia, or pious propositions, as it were. And so, what exactly would be a pious opinion?
So this is generally a pious opinion is one which is regarded as in agreement with the consciousness of the faith of the Church. In other words, it's something which seems to kind of fit, but there hasn't been a vast theological discussion about it. This is one in which it's one in which the Church and the theologians haven't really hammered out and really come into discussion with it. Sententia pia, which is one which every time I propose this, I get blasted by other priests. So I'm just going to put this out there, and I'll give their side of it so that people can see what the discussion is. But one of the sententia pia is that Saint Joseph was assumed into heaven. Now some argue no, because there's been this revelation that they're supposed to find his body later. So that all being said, there is certain so if someone wants to hold to Saint Joseph's assumption. That would be something that's in congruity with the consciousness of the church. It would seem to fit the fact that he led a sinless life, etc. He's obviously not on the same level as Our Lady. On the other hand, there is no tradition about where the guy's buried or anything like that. So that would be something which would be a sententia pia.
Right. So so in that case, it's permissible to hold it. It's also permissible not to hold it.
That's correct.
So holding at St. Joseph was not assumed as not the opposite, as not the contrary in that case. Rather,
right. It's a free area of opinion, ultimately.
Right. So what's the contrary of a sententia pia?
Well, that is something which is offensive to pious ears. So it's a propositio piarum arium offensiva. That is offensive. It's something that's offensive to religious feeling. In other words, if you have the basic Catholic faith and somebody says this, it just grates on you like there's just something off with that statement. It's offensive in some way. So one that you hear recently, especially in the last 40 years by theologians, priests, and even some of the people up in the hierarchy, making statements which I think is offensive to pious ears, is a proposition that when the Holy Family made its flight into Egypt, it constituted an act of illegal immigration. Well, that's just absurd, right? Because they didn't have the same kind of laws. They didn't have the same kind of a structure. And so, but besides, the other thing is Christ being God, he's above all law anyway. If he decides to move Our Lady, down to take him down, or St. Joseph to take him somewhere, that's his business. But that all being said, it's not a case of illegal immigration. I think that there's all sorts of things that I can't think of them right off the top of my head, but, over the last 35 years that I've formally studied theology, or almost 40 years now of formally studying theology, there's all sorts of stuff that they would say that's just offensive to pious hearing. I mean, that's just obnoxious. Right. So,
now, finally, thank you for bearing with us for this entire thing. The least degree of certainty is possessed by the tolerated opinion,
right,
which is, very weakly founded, but tolerated by the church. So let's talk about that one.
Yeah, so this is just one in which people are proposing it, and it's not something that most theologians would say, yeah, that's probably true. It's usually something like, it's something like, well, I doubt it, and I'm not so sure about it, but you can hold it. The church just tolerates it, and etc.
Right.
But this is one in which, so it's tolerated, but I don't think that it's necessarily the type of thing that they would say that, yeah, it's probably the case, etc. The opposite of that, which is one in which we're seeing quite a bit today, is it's kind of a threefold distinction. Regarding the propositions which are the negative judgments against this particular degree. And that is, the first is called a proposition badly expressed, is sometimes how it's translated into English, but it's a propositio malsonans. Basically, to put it more colloquially, it's a proposition that sounds bad, right? You're saying something this just doesn't sound good. That is, it's subject to misunderstanding by reason of its method of expression. Now think of what that means. That you're putting something out that by the very method of expression, it's likely to be misunderstood. I'll give you a perfect example. Make a mess of your diocese. Many of you know where that comes from. I'm not going to say where it came from, but this is one of those things where it was said, you should go out and make a mess of your diocese. Okay, let's put aside any theological analysis of that on the morality of charity in relationship to that. Let's just put that all aside. It doesn't matter what the moral analysis of it is. It just sounds bad. Right? Regardless of how, it would be another matter if he just says, hey, go and shake things up better in your diocese, shaking things up for the better, if he would have said something like that. Another one is a propositio captiosa, which is a captious proposition. This one is another one that we've suffered tremendously under the last 40 or 50 years, and that is, it's a proposition that is reprehensible. This is how they define it. It's reprehensible because of its intentional ambiguity. In other words, you intentionally leave it ambiguous so that people will think that it's okay. So, now, putting aside any analysis of the particular word, because as soon as you hear this, everyone's going to say, yeah, that's one of those areas. regardless of the word's history and ecclesiology, the actual meaning of the word, which I'm about to mention here, is debated to such a degree that one can legitimately conclude that it's ambiguous. And that is where in Lumen Gentium it says, this church, constituted and organized in the world as a society, subsists, that's the word, in the Catholic Church. Now, in the past, the Church said that the mystical body of Christ was the Catholic Church. There was not any kind of fudging or anything like that done. And so this is one of those things where that subsist was something that was left intentionally ambiguous, or at least it comes across as ambiguous in the way that even some of the Council Fathers came back and talked about it. It was ambiguous intentionally because they wanted to be able to include other people in the mystical body of Christ, etc., in the church that weren't part of the visible church, etc. And the church had already worked all that out. You didn't have to make it exactly how that worked, that the church, but the theologians had worked a lot of that out, especially, and this was actually the real beauty from Vatican I until up to about 1950. They had worked all that stuff out about who was a member. In fact, St. Alphonsus was, St. Robert Bellarmine was actually dealing with that particular topic, and he had pretty much laid it out. And so there was, it had become pretty clear by then. If you weren't visibly in the church, how could you be connected to it, etc.? There was all sorts of stuff that was laid out, and that was all worked out. So to sit there and say that it would subsist in the Catholic Church was a problem. Another problem is using terms which historically had very specific meanings, but then using them in a way that's contrary to that so that there's a certain ambiguity. I'll give you an example. The term or the phrase sister churches. So in the past, the term sister church only referred to those who were in union with the Holy Father. So a sister church to the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, was what? The Catholics, those are in union with the Pope, who are part of the Byzantine rites or the various rites within the church. Those were called the sister churches.
Just before our Eastern Catholic brethren blow up on the minutia, instead of rites properly, it's their church, their self-governing churches.
Churches, that's correct.
So the Byzantine Ruthenian Church, for example.
That's right.
Or the Ukrainian Church, the Maronite Church.
Thank you for that precision. I should have been more clear. Should have been more precise. But,
it's a habit. It's one of those things that
it
actually kind of surprised me how sometimes certain individuals in the past have been very petty with me about that, because it's quite obvious I mean their self-governing church.
Right.
I haven't said anything disparaging, but accidentally let slip Byzantine Rite when I meant church, because it's so habitual in American English and when dealing with the Eastern churches.
Well, and a lot of it is because that we associate the particular self-governing church with the rite that they perform, but that is a distinction. So, but anyway, the point being is that that's what the term sister church is. Well, they changed it to sister churches to anybody who had apostolic succession. And here we're not talking about formal apostolic succession, which include jurisdiction, but we're talking about like the Orthodox and things like that. And they started calling them sister churches. Well, in the proper sense, they're not churches because they're not in union with the Pope. So this is in fact, and this is the other thing that happened. I think I'm going to talk about this just very briefly, even though we've been on here for a while. There was a very subtle shift that happened in Vatican II, which I mentioned in my book, The Principle of the Integral Good. There was a very subtle shift that happened at Vatican II that went off the radar and people weren't watching, but it had gargantuan consequences. The First Vatican Council defined the papacy as the principle of unity. The principle of unity. You cannot be in union with the church that Christ established without being in union with the papacy. Now, that means that that doesn't mean that it's the principle. There are other principles of unity, and that's where they talk about, like Robert Bellarmine, like the sacraments, but the government is one of them, and the Pope is being part of that government. The same faith, etc. These are principles of unity, but they are not the principle of unity. What they did at Vatican II, if you watch it very subtly, which is the result of the branch theory, they shifted the principle of unity from the papacy to apostolic succession. And that was a gargantuan move, because then that meant that the Orthodox or anybody who had valid holy orders basically could be part of this church that Christ had established, even though they're not in union with the Pope. This created this is a theological issue that I think long term the church is going to have to really kind of work out. And then the last proposition is Propositio Scandalosa. This is a proposition which excites scandal. You state this thing and it's going to scandalize people. So, for example, bishops who say that contraception, the church's teaching on contraception is still open to discussion. Or another one that women that they could be priests is still open to discussion. I think another one is the discussion of blessing gay unions. I think that is one of those that is a scandalous proposition, and I think that long term the church is going to have to do a lot of cleanup in relationship to that. Right.
Now let's cycle back full circle here. Finis quamet small, as the old expression goes. So we're getting to in the beginning, you said you were talking about Vatican II, and we were distinguishing how Pope Paul VI had said that nothing in Vatican II pertained to a solemn judgment, to the solemn magisterium.
There was no extraordinary act.
Yeah, I shouldn't say solemn judgments. That's supposed to be the Pope. But, it wasn't an extraordinary act. It wasn't part of the extraordinary magisterium.
Right.
Now, Paul VI goes on to add in the very same address that you're citing that it was nevertheless part of the universal ordinary magisterium.
Right. So,
and I know you go through this in your book, Magisterial Authority.
Right.
And others, but real quick, so what is the universal ordinary magisterium that we have to, that he's saying Vatican II taught by?
Right. So basically he's actually using that term, though, in a way that doesn't really fulfill what most people understand by the universal ordinary magisterium. What does this mean? Okay. So the universal ordinary magisterium, which actually it's kind of interesting because I think it's Lumen Gentium 25 that actually lays it out. It's the first time that it actually occurs within a ecclesiastical document where they basically say that if the bishops dispense throughout the world unanimously hold something to be of the faith, even if it hasn't been defined, etc., then it's de fide. Right, so by a universal ordinary magisterial proposition can be infallible, but it has to be proposed by all the bishops. And some theologians have even come along and said, it's not just the bishops that are alive today. It has to be through the totality of history, or at least it can't be contrary to the totality of history. So when Paul VI said that it was part of the universal ordinary magisterium, he's talking about something that's being proposed generally by most of the bishops, or the bishops assigned off of it, and himself, so it's kind of the universal and ordinary magisterium, but it doesn't meet the definition, it doesn't meet the criteria for infallibility, which some people propose, because there was no intention in relationship to these things to put an end to discussion. That is, they don't consider these things to necessarily be of the faith. And that's a key distinction that I think that some people miss. So what does that mean? It means that they basically, that the other than the things that have already been defined or that we already know that are infallible in relationship to the Church's past traditional teachings that are in Vatican II, because sometimes people say we just have to throw all of Vatican II. Well, you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, because there's some things in there that have already been defined, right? So there are some truths in Vatican II, despite what people want to think. Okay, that being said, it means that we still have to give what they call religiosus obsequium to, which basically means religious obedience or submission in relationship to those. What does that mean? Well, religious submission basically means that we have an obligation to submit intellectually, to give assent to the things that are proposed by those things that are proposed by the members of the magisterium, unless there's sufficient reason to the contrary. And there actually can be in certain circumstances. So this is something which I got criticized recently when I was talking about vaccinations, when people said, well, he what he's saying is contrary to what the CDF pronounced. Well, yes, but are we bound by what the CDF states? Generally speaking, yes. But there was sufficient reason to, not that what's interesting is the principles they laid out were fine. The conclusion they reached was what I think wasn't accurate, because of the fact that there were other things that were not taken into consideration when making that final conclusion. So that's just the basic thing of it. Obviously, I'd always submit to what the final judgment of the church is, but these are things too that when it comes to religious submission, it's very similar to some of the other theological notes. How much I have to give assent to it is dependent upon who's proposing it, which member of the magisterium or members of the magisterium, how many of them are proposing it. Is it the Pope, or is it just some bishop? So there's varying degrees of that. And so we're normally, so in relationship to Vatican II, we have to give assent to what's there unless there's sufficient reason to the contrary. What's the sufficient reason to the contrary? The fact that the church has said something contrary to it in the past. So that would be an example.
Now, somebody will say here, well, this all seems a bit, subjective. If people start looking at things and saying, well, I think there's other things, so I'm going to withhold my assent. Who is the one who gets to decide, that, okay, something was mixed up here, or it seems like we've introduced a subjective principle that, okay, well, I don't like this in Vatican II. This seems to contradict this former teaching of Leo XIII or whoever, it's Satis Cognitum. So therefore, I'm going to say no. But someone else is going to read it and say, it sounds good to me. And he's going to accept it and give his religious assent. So which is it? So how is it, how does this avoid coming into what they will say is Protestant private judgment?
Well, I'm going to start this with the observation of, they used to talk about how when a person went to college in the past, they had general knowledge of virtually everything. And if they got a doctorate, they were very knowledgeable in a lot of areas. Like, so if they studied mathematics, they knew the totality of what was there in the mathematics. But as time went on, specialization began to occur. And so it got to the point where people would get their doctorate in, say, some... in biology, but then by the time it was done, they're just studying one little aspect of the genome in some rat somewhere, right? So what is, why am I going into this? It means that the criteria for saying that something is, that the religious assessment that I can put aside what a particular member of the Magisterium says based upon what is done in the past is the actual past. So it's the tradition. I have to go and I have to study the tradition. There still has to be within the individual who's doing this a religioso secum in the sense of a desire to submit to the legitimate teaching of whatever the church finally says. And so, but if the church hasn't finally defined these things, and if there isn't something in the tradition that lays the whole thing out, or if there's contradiction, which we're starting to see in post-conciliar documents, where they're contradicting, like religious liberty, which I mentioned in the beginning, they're contradicting this thing, then what happens is it opens up the discussion about, okay, where does the actual truth lie? And so you have to go to the objective criteria. What's the objective criteria? The first is the remote rule, which is the tradition. So it's the tradition, but you have to know the tradition well. You have to have precise knowledge of exactly how they're talking about it, and you can't just have some vague knowledge of it so that you can judge these other things properly. The second thing is the magisterium itself. So if the magisterium defines it and says, look, we realize that these statements were made, in the end, this is what we're saying you must believe. So then it ultimately becomes that. And some people say, well, you just follow whatever the most recent magisterium says. Well, you can't do that either, because a lot of times what they propose is, normally speaking, under general rules, you follow whatever the magisterium, current magisterium, living magisterium is proposing. However, all of us know that there are members of the magisterium that are saying things that are clearly contrary to what the church has always taught in the past. We have German bishops running around saying that women can still be priests, even though John Paul II in Ordinatio Sacerdotales put a complete end to that discussion. So this is one of those things where, it all boils down to, again, in a matter of precision, knowing precisely the degree by which I'm bound to a hold to this, and also I have to know the tradition to see exactly where these things do. So what does it mean? It really means that when it comes to debating these topics, it should be the prerogative of a very small number of people who have an extraordinary amount of knowledge in that particular area. That excludes 99% of the people talking about most of this stuff on the internet, by the way. And this also brings up a particular issue that I think is germane, which is that, really these issues should be discussed, normally speaking. It's one thing if the church hasn't stated something about it and everybody's kind of weighing in because Canon 217, or is that 213? It's one of those. 212 states that the lay people can make their concerns known, etc. So they recognize that they can do that. But that being said, there also has to be prudence involved. If you don't know what you're talking about, don't be weighing in on something. You've got to go study and be knowledgeable about a particular area before you're going to really weigh in on something. But and by the way, we're talking about just a small, and that's the other thing. There's just only a very few select things that are really open to theological discussion. The fact that there's all this contradiction that we're hearing from various members of the Magisterium, various bishops particularly, that are contradicting the tradition of the Church is what's really opening up this whole can of worms. If the tradition is the remote rule, that to which we must all ultimately conform, which I talk about in magisterial authority and in the binding force of tradition, then that becomes the objective rule. So it can't just be what I like or what I think. The only time you could actually get to something where you like or you think would be in something which is a sententia pia. You could do that if you want to do it based on your likes and dislikes, but even then you really should be governing your judgments based upon reason and not your emotions.
All right, Father Ripperger, thank you as always for joining us.
Thank you very much. Hopefully I wasn't too long-winded and people were able to go the distance in this one.
Well, if not, I'll just break it up into fewer segments.
There you go. All right. God bless.